You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. It's been 3 years since our last Winter Tales collection, so I'm happy to return today with Volume 3. As before, find a quiet place to recline and turn the heating up a notch or two. Chapter times can be found in the video description below. And without further ado, Between the Lights by E.F. Benson. The day had been one unceasing fall of snow from sunrise, until the gradual withdrawal of the vague white light outside indicated that the sun had set again. But as usual, at this hospitable and delightful house of Everard Chandler, where I often spent Christmas and was spending it now, there had been no lack of entertainment, and the hours had passed with a rapidity that had surprised us. A short billiard tournament had filled up the time between breakfast and lunch, with badminton and the morning papers for those who were temporarily not engaged, while afterwards, the interval till tea-time had been occupied by the majority of the party in a huge game of hide-and-seek all over the house, barring the billiard-room, which was sanctuary for any who desired peace. But few had done that. The enchantment of Christmas, I must suppose, had, like some spell, made children of us again, and it was with palsied terror and trembling misgivings that we had tiptoed up and down the dim passages, from any corner of which some wild, screaming form might dart out on us. Then, wearied with exercise and emotion, we had assembled again for tea in the hall, a room of shadows and panels on which the light from the wide-open fireplace, where there burned a divine mixture of peat and logs, flickered and grew bright again on the walls. Then, as was proper, ghost stories, for the narration of which the electric light was put out, so that the listeners might conjecture anything they pleased to be lurking in the corners, succeeded, and we vied with each other in blood, bones, skeletons, armor, and shrieks. I had just given my contribution, and was reflecting with some complacency that probably the worst was now known, when Everard, who had not yet administered to the horror of his guests, spoke. He was sitting opposite me in the full blaze of the fire, looking, after the illness he had gone through during the autumn, still rather pale and delicate. All the same, he had been among the boldest and best in the exploration of dark places that afternoon, and the look on his face now rather startled me. "No, I don't mind that sort of thing," he said. "The paraphernalia of ghosts has become somehow rather hackneyed, and when I hear of screams and skeletons, I feel I'm on familiar ground, and can at least hide my head under the bedclothes." "Ah, but the bedclothes were twitched away by my skeleton," said I in self-defense. "I know, but I don't even mind that. Why, there are 7, 8 skeletons in this room now, covered with blood and skin and other horrors. No, the nightmares of one's childhood were the really frightening things, because they were vague. There was the true atmosphere of horror about them, because one didn't know what one feared. Now, if one could recapture that." Mrs. Chandler got quickly out of her seat. "Oh, Everard," she said, "surely you don't wish to recapture it again? I should have thought once was enough." This was enchanting. A chorus of invitation asked him to proceed. The real, true ghost story first-hand, which was what seemed to be indicated, was too precious a thing to lose. Everard laughed. "No, dear, I don't want to recapture it again at all," he said to his wife. Then to us. "But really the nightmare, perhaps, to which I was referring, is of the vaguest and most unsatisfactory kind. It has no apparatus about it at all. You will probably all say that it was nothing, and wonder why I was frightened. But I was. It frightened me out of my wits. And I only just saw something, without being able to swear what it was, and heard something which might have been a falling stone. Anyhow, tell us about the falling stone, said I. There was a stir of movement about the circle round the fire, and the movement was not of purely physical order. It was as if, this is only what I personally felt, it was as if the childish gaiety of the hours we had passed that day was suddenly withdrawn. We had jested on certain subjects. We had played hide-and-seek with all the power of earnestness that was in us. But now, so it seemed to me, there was going to be real hide-and-seek. Real terrors were going to lurk in dark corners. Or if not real terrors, terrors so convincing as to assume the garb of reality were going to pounce on us. And Mrs. Chandler's exclamation as she sat down again, "Oh, Everard, won't it excite you?" tended in any case to excite us. The room still remained in dubious darkness, except for the sudden lights disclosed on the walls by the leaping flames on the hearth, and there was wide field for conjecture as to what might lurk in the dim corners. Everard, moreover, who had been sitting in bright light before, was banished by the extinction of some flaming log into the shadows. A voice alone spoke to us as he sat back in his low chair, a voice rather slow but very distinct. "Last year," he said, "on the 24th of December, we were down here as usual, Amy and I, for Christmas. Several of you who are here now were here then. 3 or 4 of you, at least. I was one of these, but like the others kept silence. For the identification, so it seemed to me, was not asked for. And he went on again without a pause. Those of you who were here then, he said, and are here now, will remember how very warm it was this day year. You'll remember, too, that we played croquet that day on the lawn. It was perhaps a little cold for croquet, and we played it rather in order to be able to say, with sound evidence to back the statement, that we had done so. Then he turned and addressed the whole little circle. We played ties of half games, he said, just as we have played billiards today, and it was certainly as warm on the lawn then as it was in the billiard room this morning directly after breakfast, while today I should not wonder if there was 3 feet of snow outside. More, probably. Listen. A sudden draught fluted in the chimney, and the fire flared up as the current of air caught it. The wind also drove the snow against the windows, and as he said, "Listen," we heard a soft scurry of the falling flakes against the panes, like the soft tread of many little people who stepped lightly, but with the persistence of multitudes who were flocking to some rendezvous. Hundreds of little feet seemed to be gathering outside. Only the glass kept them out. And of the 8 skeletons present, 4 or 5 anyhow, turned and looked at the windows. These were small-paned, with leaden bars. On the leaden bars, little heaps of snow had accumulated, but there was nothing else to be seen. Yes, last Christmas Eve was very warm and sunny, went on Everard. We had had no frost that autumn, and a temerarious dahlia was still in flower. I have always thought that it must have been mad. He paused a moment. And I wonder if I were not mad too, he added. No one interrupted him. There was something arresting, I must suppose, in what he was saying. It chimed in anyhow with the hide-and-seek, with the suggestions of the lonely snow. Mrs. Chandler had sat down again, but I heard her stir in her chair. But never was there a gay party so reduced as we had been in the last 5 minutes. Instead of laughing at ourselves for playing silly games, we were all taking a serious game seriously. Anyhow, I was sitting out, he said to me, while you and my wife played your half game of croquet. Then it struck me that it was not so warm as I had supposed, because quite suddenly I shivered, and shivering I looked up. But I did not see you and her playing croquet at all. I saw something which had no relation to you and her. At least I hope not. Now the angler lands his fish, the stalker kills his stag, and the speaker holds his audience. And as the fish is gaffed, and as the stag is shot, so were we held. There was no getting away till he had finished with us. You all know the croquet lawn, he said, and how it is bounded all round by a flower border, with a brick wall behind it, through which, you'll remember, there is only one gate. Well, I looked up and saw that the lawn, I could for one moment see it was still a lawn, was shrinking, and the walls closing in upon it. As they closed in too, they grew higher, and simultaneously the light began to fade and be sucked from the sky, till it grew quite dark overhead, and only a glimmer of light came in through the gate. There was, as I told you, a dahlia in flower that day, and as this dreadful darkness and bewilderment came over me, I remember that my eyes sought it in a kind of despair, holding on, as it were, to any familiar object. But it was no longer a dahlia, and for the red of its petals I saw only the red of some feeble firelight, and at that moment the hallucination was complete. I was no longer sitting on the lawn watching croquet, but I was in a low-roofed room, something like a cattle shed, but round. Close above my head, though I was sitting down, ran rafters from wall to wall. It was nearly dark, but a little light came in from the door opposite to me, which seemed to lead into a passage that communicated with the exterior of the place. Little, however, of the wholesome air came into this dreadful den. The atmosphere was oppressive and foul beyond all telling. It was as if for years it had been the place of some human menagerie, and for those years had been uncleaned and unsweetened by the winds of heaven. Yet that oppressiveness was nothing to the awful horror of the place from the view of the spirit. Some dreadful atmosphere of crime and abomination dwelt heavy in it. Its denizens, whoever they were scarce human, so it seemed to me, and though men and women, were akin more to the beasts of the field. And in addition there was present to me some sense of the weight of years. I had been taken and thrust down into some epoch of dim antiquity. He paused a moment, and the fire on the hearth leaped up for a second and then died down again. But in that gleam I saw that all faces were turned to Everard, and that all wore some look of dreadful expectancy. Certainly I felt it myself, and waited in a sort of shrinking horror for what was coming. As I told you, he continued, where there had been that unseasonable dahlia, there now burned a dim firelight, and my eyes were drawn there. Shapes were gathered round it. What they were I could not at first see. Then perhaps my eyes got more accustomed to the dusk, or the fire burned better, for I perceived that they were of human form, but very small, for when one rose with a horrible chattering to his feet, his head was still some inches off the low roof. He was dressed in a sort of shirt that came to his knees, but his arms were bare and covered with hair. Then the gesticulation and chattering increased, and I knew that they were talking about me, for they kept pointing in my direction. At that my horror suddenly deepened, for I became aware that I was powerless and could not move hand or foot. A helpless, nightmare impotence had possession of me. I could not lift a finger or turn my head, and in the paralysis of that fear I tried to scream, but not a sound could I utter. All this, I suppose, took place with the instantaneousness of a dream, for at once, and without transition, the whole thing had vanished, and I was back on the lawn again, while the stroke for which my wife was aiming was still unplayed. But my face was dripping with perspiration, and I was trembling all over. Now, you may all say that I had fallen asleep and had a sudden nightmare. That may be so, but I was conscious of no sense of sleepiness before, and I was conscious of none afterwards. It was as if someone had held a book before me, whisked the pages open for a second, and closed them again. Somebody, I don't know who, got up from his chair with a sudden movement that made me start, and turned on the electric light. I do not mind confessing that I was rather glad of this. Everard laughed. "Really, I feel like Hamlet in the play scene," he said, "and as if there was a guilty uncle present. Shall I go on?" I don't think anyone replied, and he went on. "Well, let us say for the moment that it was not a dream exactly, but a hallucination. Whichever it was, in any case it haunted me. For months, I think, it was never quite out of my mind, but lingered somewhere in the dusk of consciousness, sometimes sleeping quietly, so to speak, but sometimes stirring in its sleep. It was no good my telling myself that I was disquieting myself in vain, for it was as if something had actually entered into my very soul, as if some seed of horror had been planted there. And as the weeks went on, the seed began to sprout, so that I could no longer even tell myself that that vision had been a moment's disorderment only. I can't say that it actually affected my health. I did not, as far as I know, sleep or eat insufficiently. But morning after morning I used to wake, not gradually and through pleasant dozings into full consciousness, but with absolute suddenness, and find myself plunged in an abyss of despair. Often, too, eating or drinking, I used to pause and wonder if it was worth while. Eventually, I told 2 people about my trouble, hoping that perhaps the mere communication would help matters, hoping also, but very distantly, that though I could not believe at present that digestion or the obscurities of the nervous system were at fault, a doctor by some simple dose might convince me of it. In other words, I told my wife, who laughed at me, and my doctor, who laughed also, and assured me that my health was quite unnecessarily robust. At the same time, he suggested that change of air and scene does wonders for the delusions that exist merely in the imagination. He also told me, in answer to a direct question, that he would stake his reputation on the certainty that I was not going mad. Well, we went up to London as usual for the season, and though nothing whatever occurred to remind me in any way of that single moment on Christmas Eve, the reminding was seen to all right. The moment itself took care of that, for instead of fading, as is the way of sleeping or waking dreams, it grew every day more vivid and ate, so to speak, like some corrosive acid into my mind, etching itself there. And to London succeeded Scotland. I took last year for the first time a small forest up in Sutherland called Glen Callan, very remote and wild, but affording excellent stalking. It was not far from the sea, and the gillies used always to warn me to carry a compass on the hill, because sea mists were liable to come up with frightful rapidity, and there was always a danger of being caught by one, and of having perhaps to wait hours till it cleared again. This at first I always used to do, but, as everyone knows, any precaution that one takes which continues to be unjustified gets gradually relaxed, and at the end of a few weeks, since the weather had been uniformly clear, it was natural that, as often as not, my compass remained at home. One day, the stalk took me onto a part of my ground that I had seldom been on before, a very high tableland on the limit of my forest, which went down very steeply on one side to a loch that lay below it, and on the other, by gentler gradations, to the river that came from the loch, 6 miles below which stood the lodge. The wind had necessitated our climbing up, or so my stalker had insisted, not by the easier way, but up the crags from the loch. I had argued the point with him, for it seemed to me that it was impossible that the deer could get our scent if we went by the more natural path, but he still held to his opinion, and therefore, since, after all, this was his part of the job, I yielded. A dreadful climb we had of it, over big boulders with deep holes in between, masked by clumps of heather, so that a wary eye and a prodding stick were necessary for each step if one wished to avoid broken bones. Adders also literally swarmed in the heather. We must have seen a dozen at least on our way up, and adders are a beast for which I have no manner of use. But a couple of hours saw us to the top, only to find that the stalker had been utterly at fault, and that the deer must quite infallibly have got wind of us, if they had remained in the place where we last saw them. That, when we could spy the ground again, we saw had happened. In any case, they had gone. The man insisted the wind had changed, a palpably stupid excuse, and I wondered at that moment what other reason he had, for reason I felt sure there must be, for not wishing to take what would clearly now have been a better route. But this piece of bad management did not spoil our luck, for within an hour we had spied more deer, and about 2 o'clock I got a shot, killing a heavy stag. Then, sitting on the heather, I ate lunch, and enjoyed a well-earned bask and smoke in the sun. The pony, meantime, had been saddled with the stag, and was plodding homewards. The morning had been extraordinarily warm, with a little wind blowing off the sea, which lay a few miles off, sparkling beneath a blue haze, and all morning, in spite of our abominable climb, I had had an extreme sense of peace, so much so that several times I probed my mind, so to speak, to find if the horror still lingered there. But I could scarcely get any response from it. Never since Christmas had I been so free of fear, and it was with a great sense of repose, both physical and spiritual, that I lay looking up into the blue sky, watching my smoke whirls coal slowly away into nothingness. But I was not allowed to take my ease long, for Sandy came and begged that I would move. The weather had changed, he said. The wind had shifted again, and he wanted me to be off this high ground and on the path again as soon as possible, because it looked to him as if a sea mist would presently come up. And yon's a bad place to get down in the mist, he added, nodding towards the crags we had come up. I looked at the man in amazement, for to our right lay a gentle slope down onto the river, and there was now no possible reason for again tackling those hideous rocks up which we had climbed this morning. More than ever, I was sure he had some secret reason for not wishing to go the obvious way. But about one thing he was certainly right. The mist was coming up from the sea, and I felt in my pocket for the compass, and found I had forgotten to bring it. Then there followed a curious scene which lost us time that we could really ill afford to waste. I insisting on going down by the way that common sense directed, he imploring me to take his word for it that the crags were the better way. Eventually, I marched off to the easier descent, and told him not to argue any more, but follow. What annoyed me about him was that he would only give the most senseless reasons for preferring the crags. There were mossy places, he said, on the way I wished to go, a thing patently false, since the summer had been one spell of unbroken weather, or it was longer, also obviously untrue, or there were so many vipers about. But seeing that none of these arguments produced any effect, at last he desisted, and came after me in silence. We were not yet half down, when the mist was upon us, shooting up from the valley like the broken water of a wave, and in 3 minutes we were enveloped in a cloud of fog so thick that we could barely see a dozen yards in front of us. It was therefore another cause for self-congratulation that we were not now, as we should otherwise have been, precariously clambering on the face of those crags up which we had come with such difficulty in the morning, and as I rather prided myself on my powers of generalship in the matter of direction, I continued leading, feeling sure that before long we should strike the track by the river. More than all, the absolute freedom from fear elated me. Since Christmas I had not known the instinctive joy of that. I felt like a schoolboy home for the holidays. But the mist grew thicker and thicker, and whether it was that real rain clouds had formed above it, or that it was of an extraordinary density itself, I got wetter in the next hour than I have ever been before or since. The wet seemed to penetrate the skin and chill the very bones, and still there was no sign of the track for which I was making. Behind me, muttering to himself, followed the stalker, but his arguments and protestations were dumb, and it seemed as if he kept close to me, as if afraid. Now, there are many unpleasant companions in this world. I would not, for instance, care to be on the hill with a drunkard or a maniac, but worse than either, I think, is a frightened man, because his trouble is infectious, and, insensibly, I began to be afraid of being frightened too. From that it is but a short step to fear. Other perplexities, too, beset us. At one time, we seemed to be walking on flat ground. At another, I felt sure we were climbing again, whereas all the time we ought to have been descending, unless we had missed the way very badly indeed. Also, for the month was October, it was beginning to get dark, and it was with a sense of relief that I remembered that the full moon would rise soon after sunset. But it had grown very much colder, and soon, instead of rain, we found we were walking through a steady fall of snow. Things were pretty bad, but then for the moment they seemed to mend, for, far away to the left, I suddenly heard the brawling of the river. It should, it is true, have been straight in front of me, and we were perhaps a mile out of our way, but this was better than the blind wandering of the last hour, and turning to the left, I walked towards it. But before I had gone 100 yards, I heard a sudden choked cry behind me, and just saw Sandy's form flying as if in terror of pursuit into the mists. I called to him, but got no reply, and heard only the spurned stones of his running. What had frightened him I had no idea, but certainly with his disappearance, the infection of his fear disappeared also, and I went on, I may almost say, with gaiety. On the moment, however, I saw a sudden well-defined blackness in front of me, and before I knew what I was doing, I was half stumbling, half walking up a very steep grass slope. During the last few minutes the wind had got up, and the driving snow was peculiarly uncomfortable, but there had been a certain consolation in thinking that the wind would soon disperse these mists, and I had nothing more than a moonlight walk home. But, as I paused on this slope, I became aware of two things. One, that the blackness in front of me was very close. The other that, whatever it was, it sheltered me from the snow. So I climbed on 12 yards into its friendly shelter, for it seemed to me to be friendly. A wall some 12 feet high crowned the slope, and exactly where I struck it there was a hole in it, or door rather, through which a little light appeared. Wondering at this, I pushed on, bending down, for the passage was very low, and in 12 yards came out on the other side. Just as I did this, the sky suddenly grew lighter, the wind, I suppose, having dispersed the mists, and the moon, though not yet visible through the flying skirts of cloud, made sufficient illumination. I was in a circular enclosure, and above me there projected from the wall some 4 feet from the ground broken stones, which must have been intended to support a floor. Then, simultaneously, 2 things occurred. The whole of my 9 months' terror came back to me, for I saw that the vision in the garden was fulfilled, and at the same moment I saw stealing towards me a little figure as of a man, but only about 3'6" in height. That my eyes told me. My ears told me that he stumbled on a stone. My nostrils told me that the air I breathed was of an overpowering foulness, and my soul told me that it was sick unto death. I think I tried to scream, but could not. I know I tried to move and could not, and it crept closer. Then I suppose the terror which held me spellbound so spurred me that I must move. For next moment I heard a cry break from my lips and was stumbling through the passage. I made one leap of it down the grass slope, and ran as I hope never to have to run again. What direction I took I did not pause to consider, so long as I put distance between me and that place. Luck, however, favoured me, and before long I struck the track by the river, and an hour afterwards reached the lodge. Next day I developed a chill, and as you know, pneumonia laid me on my back for 6 weeks. Well, that is my story, and there are many explanations. You may say that I fell asleep on the lawn, and was reminded of that by finding myself, under discouraging circumstances, in an old Pict's castle, where a sheep or a goat that, like myself, had taken shelter from the storm was moving about. Yes, there are hundreds of ways in which you may explain it. But the coincidence was an odd one, and those who believe in second sight might find an instance of their hobby in it. And that is all? I asked. Yes, it was nearly too much for me. I think the dressing bell has sounded. Smee by A.M. Burrage. No, said Jackson, with a deprecatory smile. I'm sorry, I don't want to upset your game. I shan't be doing that because you'll have plenty without me, but I'm not playing any games of hide-and-seek. It was Christmas Eve, and we were a party of 14, with just the proper leavening of youth. We had dined well, it was the season for childish games, and we were all in the mood for playing them. All that is, except Jackson. When somebody suggested hide-and-seek, there was rapturous and almost unanimous approval. His was the one dissentient voice. It was not like Jackson to spoil sport or refuse to do as others wanted. Somebody asked him if he were feeling seedy. No, he answered. I feel perfectly fit, thanks, but, he added, with a smile which softened without retracting the flat refusal, I'm not playing hide-and-seek. One of us asked him why not. He hesitated for some seconds before replying. I sometimes go and stay at a house where a girl was killed through playing hide-and-seek in the dark. She didn't know the house very well. There was a servant's staircase with a door to it. When she was pursued, she opened the door and jumped into what she must have thought was one of the bedrooms, and she broke her neck at the bottom of the stairs. We all looked concerned, and Mrs. Fernley said, How awful! And you were there when it happened? Jackson shook his head very gravely. No, he said, but I was there when something else happened. Something worse. I shouldn't have thought anything could be worse. This was, said Jackson, and shuddered visibly. Or so it seemed to me. I think he wanted to tell the story and was angling for encouragement. A few requests, which may have seemed to him to lack urgency, he affected to ignore and went off at a tangent. I wonder if any of you have played a game called Smee. It's a great improvement on the ordinary game of hide-and-seek. The name derives from the ungrammatical colloquialism, it's me. You might care to play if you're going to play a game of that sort. Let me tell you the rules. Every player is presented with a sheet of paper. All the sheets are blank except one, on which is written Smee. Nobody knows who is Smee except Smee himself, or herself as the case may be. The lights are then turned out, and Smee slips from the room and goes off to hide, and after an interval the other players go off in search, without knowing whom they are actually in search of. One player meeting another challenges with the word Smee, and the other player, if not the one concerned, answers Smee. The real Smee makes no answer when challenged, and the second player remains quietly by him. Presently they will be discovered by a third player, who, having challenged and received no answer, will link up with the first two. This goes on until all the players have formed a chain, and the last to join is marked down for a forfeit. It's a good, noisy, romping game, and in a big house it often takes a long time to complete the chain. You might care to try it, and I'll pay my forfeit and smoke one of Tim's excellent cigars here by the fire until you get tired of it." I remarked that it sounded a good game, and asked Jackson if he had played it himself. "Yes," he answered. "I played it in the house I was telling you about." "And she was there, the girl who broke—" No, Mrs. Fernley interrupted. "He told us he wasn't there when it happened." Jackson considered. "I don't know if she were there or not. I'm afraid she was. I know that there were 13 of us, and there ought only to have been 12. And I'll swear that I didn't know her name, or I think I should have gone clean off my head when I heard that whisper in the dark. No, you don't catch me playing that game, or any other like it any more. It spoilt my nerve quite a while, and I can't afford to take long holidays. Besides, it saves a lot of trouble and inconvenience to own up at once to being a coward." Tim Vouse, the best of hosts, smiled around at us, and in that smile there was a meaning which is sometimes vulgarly expressed by the slow closing of an eye. "There's a story coming," he announced. "There's certainly a story of sorts," said Jackson, "but whether it's coming or not—" He paused and shrugged his shoulders. "Well, you're going to pay a forfeit instead of playing? Please, but have a heart and let me down lightly. It's not just sheer cussedness on my part." "Payment in advance," said Tim, "ensures honesty and promotes good feeling. You are therefore sentenced to tell the story here and now." And here follows Jackson's story, unrevised by me and passed on without comment to a wider public. Some of you, I know, have run across the Sangstons. Christopher Sangston and his wife, I mean. They're distant connections of mine. At least Violet Sangston is. About 8 years ago they bought a house between the North and South Downs, on the Surrey and Sussex border, and 5 years ago they invited me to come and spend Christmas with them. It was a fairly old house. I couldn't say exactly of what period, and it certainly deserved the epithet rambling. It wasn't a particularly big house, but the original architect, whoever he may have been, had not concerned himself with economizing in space, and at first you could get lost in it quite easily. Well, I went down for that Christmas, assured by Violet's letter that I knew most of my fellow guests, and that the 2 or 3 who might be strangers to me were all lambs. Unfortunately, I'm one of the world's workers, and I couldn't get away until Christmas Eve, although the other members of the party had assembled on the preceding day. Even then I had to cut it rather fine to be there for dinner on my first night. They were all dressing when I arrived, and I had to go straight to my room and waste no time. I may even have kept dinner waiting for a bit, for I was last down, and it was announced within a minute of my entering the drawing-room. There was just time to say hello to everybody I knew, to be briefly introduced to the 2 or 3 I didn't know, and then I had to give my arm to Mrs. Gorman. I mention this as the reason why I didn't catch the name of a tall, dark, handsome girl I hadn't met before. Everything was rather hurried, and I am always bad at catching people's names. She looked cold and clever and rather forbidding, the sort of girl who gives the impression of knowing all about men, and the more she knows of them, the less she likes them. I felt that I wasn't going to hit it off with this particular lamb of Violet's, but she looked interesting all the same, and I wondered who she was. I didn't ask, because I was pretty sure of hearing somebody address her by name before very long. Unluckily, though, I was a long way off her at table, and as Mrs. Gorman was at the top of her form that night, I soon forgot to worry about who she might be. Mrs. Gorman is one of the most amusing women I know, an outrageous but quite innocent flirt, with a very sprightly wit which isn't always unkind. She can think half a dozen moves ahead in conversation just as an expert can in a game of chess. We were soon sparring, or rather I was covering against the ropes, and I quite forgot to ask her in an undertone the name of the cold, proud beauty. The lady on the other side of me was a stranger, or had been until a few minutes since, and I didn't think of seeking information in that quarter. There was a round dozen of us, including the Sangstons themselves, and we were all young, or trying to be. The Sangstons themselves were the oldest members of the party, and their son, Reggie, in his last year at Marlborough, must have been the youngest. When there was talk of playing games after dinner, it was he who suggested Smee. He told us how to play it just as I've described it to you. His father chipped in as soon as we all understood what was going to be required of us. "If there are any games of that sort going on in the house," he said, "for goodness sake be careful of the back stairs on the first-floor landing. There's a door to them, and I've often meant to take it down. In the dark, anybody who doesn't know the house very well might think they were walking into a room. A girl actually did break her neck on those stairs about 10 years ago, when the Ainstys lived here." I asked how it happened. "Oh," said Sangston, "there was a party here one Christmas time, and they were playing hide-and-seek as you proposed doing. This girl was one of the hiders. She heard somebody coming, ran along the passage to get away, and opened the door of what she thought was a bedroom, evidently with the intention of hiding behind it while her pursuer went past. Unfortunately, it was the door leading to the back stairs, and that staircase is as straight and almost as steep as the shaft of a pit. She was dead when they picked her up. We all promised for our own sakes to be careful. Mrs. Gorman said that she was sure nothing could happen to her, since she was insured by 3 different newspapers, and her next of kin was a brother whose consistent ill luck was a byword in the family. You see, none of us had known the unfortunate girl, and as the tragedy was 10 years old, there was no need to pull long faces about it. Well, we started the game almost immediately after dinner. The men allowed themselves only 5 minutes before joining the ladies, and then young Reggie Sangston went round and assured himself that the lights were out all over the house except in the servants' quarters and in the drawing-room where we were assembled. We then got busy with 12 sheets of paper, which he twisted into pellets and shook up between his hands before passing them round. 11 of them were blank, and Smee was written on the 12th. The person drawing the latter was the one who had to hide. I looked and saw that mine was a blank. A moment later, out went the electric lights, and in the darkness I heard somebody get up and creep to the door. After a minute or so, somebody gave a signal, and we made a rush for the door. I, for one, hadn't the least idea which of the party was Smee. For 5 or 10 minutes, we were all rushing up and down passages and in and out of rooms, challenging one another and answering, "Smee? Smee." After a bit, the alarms and excursions died down, and I guessed that Smee was found. Eventually I found a chain of people, all sitting still and holding their breath on some narrow stairs leading up to a row of attics. I hastily joined it, having challenged and been answered with silence, and presently 2 more stragglers arrived, each racing the other to avoid being last. Sangston was one of them. Indeed, it was he who was marked down for a forfeit, and after a little while he remarked in an undertone, "I think we're all here now, aren't we?" He struck a match, looked up the shaft of the staircase, and began to count. It wasn't hard, although we just about filled the staircase, for we were sitting each a step or 2 one above the next, and all our heads were visible. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he concluded, and then laughed. "Dash it all, that's 1 too many." The match had burnt out, and he struck another, and began again to count. He got as far as 12, and then uttered an exclamation. "There are 13 people here," he exclaimed. I haven't counted myself yet." "Oh, nonsense," I laughed. "You probably began with yourself, and now want to count yourself twice." Out came his son's electric torch, giving a brighter and steadier light, and we all began to count. Of course, we numbered 12. Sangston laughed. "Well," he said, "I could have sworn I counted 13 twice." From halfway up the stairs came Violet Sangston's voice with a little nervous trill in it. "I thought there was somebody sitting 2 steps above me. Have you moved up, Captain Ransom?" Ransom said that he hadn't. He also said that he thought there was somebody sitting between Violet and himself. Just for a moment, there was an uncomfortable something in the air, a little cold ripple which touched us all. For that little moment, it seemed to all of us, I think, that something odd and unpleasant had happened and was liable to happen again. Then we laughed at ourselves and at one another and were comfortable once more. There were only 12 of us, and there could only have been 12 of us. And there was no argument about it. Still laughing, we trooped back to the drawing room to begin again. This time I was Smee, and Violet Sangston ran me to earth while I was still looking for a hiding place. That round didn't last long, and we were a chain of 12 within 2 or 3 minutes. Afterwards, there was a short interval. Violet wanted a wrap fetched for her, and her husband went up to get it from her room. He was no sooner gone than Reggie pulled me by the sleeve. I saw that he was looking pale and sick. "Quick," he whispered, "while Father's out of the way, take me into the smoke room and give me a brandy or a whiskey or something. You know, the sort of dose a fellow ought to have." Outside the room I asked him what was the matter, but he didn't answer at first, and I thought it better to dose him first and question him afterwards. So I mixed him a pretty dark-complexioned brandy and soda, which he drank at a gulp, and then began to puff as if he had been running. "I've had rather a turn," he said to me, with a sheepish grin. "What's the matter?" "I don't know. You were Smee just now, weren't you? Well, of course I didn't know who Smee was, and while Mother and the others ran into the west wing and found you, I turned east. There's a deep clothes cupboard in my bedroom. I'd marked it down as a good place to hide when it was my turn, and I had an idea that Smee might be there. I opened the door in the dark, felt round, and touched somebody's hand. 'Smee?' I whispered, and not getting any answer, I thought I had found Smee. Well, I don't know how it was, but an odd, creepy feeling came over me. I can't describe it, but I felt that something was wrong. So I turned on my electric torch, and there was nobody there. Now I swear I touched a hand, and I was filling up the doorway of the cupboard at the time, so nobody could get out and past me." He puffed again. "What do you make of it?" he asked. "You imagine that you touched a hand," I answered, naturally enough. He uttered a short laugh. "Of course I knew you were going to say that," he said. "I must have imagined it, mustn't I?" He paused and swallowed. "I mean, it couldn't have been anything else but imagination, could it?" I assured him that it couldn't, meaning what I said, and he accepted this, but rather with the philosophy of one who knows he is right but doesn't expect to be believed. We returned together to the drawing room, where, by that time, they were all waiting for us and ready to start again. It may have been my imagination, although I'm almost sure it wasn't, but it seemed to me that all enthusiasm for the game had suddenly melted like a white frost in strong sunlight. If anybody had suggested another game, I'm sure we should all have been grateful and abandoned Smee. Only nobody did. Nobody seemed to like to. I, for one, and I can speak for some of the others too, was oppressed with the feeling that there was something wrong. I couldn't have said what I thought was wrong. Indeed, I didn't think about it at all. But somehow all the sparkle had gone out of the fun, and hovering over my mind like a shadow was the warning of some sixth sense which told me that there was an influence in the house which was neither sane, sound, nor healthy. Why did I feel like that? Because Sangston had counted 13 of us instead of 12, and his son had thought he had touched somebody in an empty cupboard? No, there was more in it than just that. One would have laughed at such things in the ordinary way, and it was just that feeling of something being wrong which stopped me from laughing. Well, we started again, and when we went in pursuit of the unknown Smee, we were as noisy as ever, but it seemed to me that most of us were acting. Frankly, for no reason other than the one I'd given you, we'd stopped enjoying the game. I had an instinct to hunt with the main pack, but after a few minutes, during which no Smee had been found, my instinct to play winning games and be first if possible set me searching on my own account. And on the first floor of the west wing, following the wall which was actually the shell of the house, I blundered against a pair of human knees. I put out my hand and touched a soft, heavy curtain. Then I knew where I was. There were tall, deeply recessed windows with seats along the landing, and curtains over the recesses to the ground. Somebody was sitting in a corner of this window seat, behind the curtain. Aha! I had caught Smee. So I drew the curtain aside, stepped in, and touched the bare arm of a woman. It was a dark night outside, and moreover, the window was not only curtained, but a blind hung down to where the bottom panes joined up with the frame. Between the curtain and the window it was as dark as the plague of Egypt. I could not have seen my hand held 6 inches before my face, much less the woman sitting in the corner. "Smee?" I whispered. I had no answer. Smee, when challenged, does not answer. So I sat down beside her, first in the field, to await the others. Then, having settled myself, I leaned over to her and whispered, "Who is it? What's your name, Smee?" And out of the darkness beside me, the whisper came back, "Brenda Ford." I didn't know the name, but because I didn't know it, I guessed at once who she was. The tall, pale, dark girl was the only person in the house I didn't know by name. Ergo, my companion was the tall, pale, dark girl. It seemed rather intriguing to be there with her, shut in between a heavy curtain and a window, and I rather wondered whether she was enjoying the game we were all playing. Somehow she hadn't seemed to me to be one of the romping sort. I muttered 1 or 2 commonplace questions to her, and had no answer. Smee is a game of silence. Smee and the person or persons who have found Smee are supposed to keep quiet to make it hard for the others. But there was nobody else about, and it occurred to me that she was playing the game a little too much to the letter. I spoke again, and got no answer, and then I began to be annoyed. She was of that cold, superior type which affects to despise men. She didn't like me, and she was sheltering behind the rules of a game for children to be discourteous. Well, if she didn't like sitting there with me, I certainly didn't want to be sitting there with her. I half turned from her and began to hope that we should both be discovered without much more delay. Having discovered that I didn't like being there alone with her, it was queer how soon I found myself hating it, and that for a reason very different from the one which had first whetted my annoyance. The girl I had met for the first time before dinner and seen diagonally across the table had a sort of cold charm about her which had attracted while it had half angered me. For the girl who was with me, imprisoned in the opaque darkness between the curtain and the window, I felt no attraction at all. It was so very much the reverse that I should have wondered at myself if, after the first shock of the discovery that she had suddenly become repellent to me, I had no room in my mind for anything besides the consciousness that her close presence was an increasing horror to me. It came upon me just as quickly as I've uttered the words. My flesh suddenly shrank from her, as you see a strip of gelatine shrink and wither before the heat of a fire. That feeling of something being wrong had come back to me, but multiplied to an extent which turned foreboding into actual terror. I firmly believed that I should have got up and run, if I had not felt that at my first movement she would have divined my intention and compelled me to stay by some means of which I could not bear to think. The memory of having touched her bare arm made me wince and draw in my lips. I prayed that somebody else would come along soon. My prayer was answered. Light footfalls sounded on the landing. Somebody on the other side of the curtain brushed against my knees. The curtain was drawn aside, and a woman's hand, fumbling in the darkness, presently rested on my shoulder. "Smee?" whispered a voice which I instantly recognized as Mrs. Gorman's. Of course, she received no answer. She came and settled down beside me with a rustle, and I can't describe the sense of relief she brought me. "It's Tony, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "You're not Smee, are you?" "No, she's on my other side." She reached a hand across me, and I heard one of her nails scratch the surface of a woman's silk gown. "Hello, Smee. How are you? Who are you? Oh, is it against the rules to talk? Never mind. Tony, we'll break the rules. Do you know, Tony, this game is beginning to irk me a little. I hope they're not going to run it to death by playing it all the evening. I'd like to play some game where we can all be together in the same room with a nice bright fire." "Same here," I agreed fervently. "Can't you suggest something when we go down? There's something rather uncanny in this particular amusement. I can't quite shed the delusion that there's somebody in this game who oughtn't to be in it at all." That was just how I had been feeling, but I didn't say so. But for my part, the worst of my qualms were now gone. The arrival of Mrs. Gorman had dissipated them. We sat on talking, wondering from time to time when the rest of the party would arrive. I don't know how long elapsed before we heard a clatter of feet on the landing and young Reggie's voice shouting, "Hello, hello there. Anybody there?" "Yes." "Mrs. Gorman with you?" "Yes," I answered. "Well, you're a nice pair. You're both forfeited. We've all been waiting for you for hours." "Why, you haven't found Smee yet," I objected. "You haven't, you mean? I happen to have been Smee myself." "But Smee's here with us," I cried. "Yes," agreed Mrs. Gorman. The curtain was stripped aside, and in a moment we were blinking into the eye of Reggie's electric torch. I looked at Mrs. Gorman, and then on my other side. Between me and the wall, there was an empty space on the window seat. I stood up at once and wished I hadn't, for I found myself sick and dizzy. "There was somebody there," I maintained, "because I touched her." "So did I," said Mrs. Gorman in a voice which had lost its steadiness. "And I don't see how she could have got up and gone without our knowing it." Reggie uttered a queer, shaken laugh. He, too, had had an unpleasant experience that evening. "Somebody's been playing the goat," he remarked. "Coming down?" We were not very popular when we arrived in the drawing-room. Reggie rather tactlessly gave it out that he had found us sitting on a window seat behind a curtain. I taxed the tall dark girl with having pretended to be Smee, and afterwards slipping away. She denied it. After which we settled down and played other games. Smee was done with for the evening, and I for one was glad of it. Some long while later, during an interval, Sangston told me, if I wanted a drink, to go into the smoke-room and help myself. I went, and he presently followed me. I could see that he was rather peeved with me, and the reason came out during the following minute or two. It seemed that in his opinion, if I must sit out and flirt with Mrs. Gorman, in circumstances which would have been considered highly compromising in his young days, I needn't do it during a round game and keep everybody else waiting for us. "But there was somebody else there," I protested. "Somebody pretending to be Smee. I believe it was that tall, dark girl, Miss Ford, although she denied it. She even whispered her name to me." Sangston stared at me and nearly dropped his glass. "Miss who?" he shouted. "Brenda Ford, she told me her name was." Sangston put down his glass and laid a hand on my shoulder. "Look here, old man," he said. "I don't mind a joke, but don't let it go too far. We don't want all the women in the house getting hysterical. Brenda Ford is the name of the girl who broke her neck on the stairs playing hide-and-seek here 10 years ago." The Snowman by Loretta Burrough. Philip's lodge was enchantingly complete, like a perfect little doll's house set down in a wilderness. Outside, a marching pile of snowy hills, dotted far away with pale roofs. Inside, small, warm, polished rooms with everything ready to your hand. Nancy, examining her face in the mirror above the bureau, reflected that she had looked 30 when she had married Phil a few days ago, but now she was her proper age, 20. 3 days of Philip's love had searched out and swept clean those dark, desperate places in her, where Spencer, her first husband, had left his spoiler's mark. For a moment, she looked into the mirror almost as though she expected to see Spencer's lean, olive face beside hers, faintly mocking, tasting a cruel pleasure. He had been much too old for her. There had been in him no kindness, no joy. Shying violently away from thought of him, she went to the wide windows that cornered the bedroom. She could hear Philip downstairs in the living room. A snatch of tune whistled sharply, thumps and rustles, as he unpacked the books they had brought with them this afternoon. She leaned upon the window-sill, peering out beyond the frosty panes to the violet-shadowed landscape. Then suddenly she called, "Philip! Oh, Phil!" She must have been hugged as close in his thoughts as he had been in hers, because he answered at once, "Coming, Nancy." "Philip," she said, when he walked into the room. "What is that odd thing up there on the hill? I'm sure I didn't notice it when we drove in this afternoon." He came closer to her, gently taking her waist between his hands and leaning across her shoulder. "What odd thing?" "Oh, I see." Whatever it was, it had the most curious air of inexact mystery about it, probably because it stood in the shadow of a snow-bowed larch, and the landscape was already half submerged in night. All that Nancy could truly discern was a kind of gleaming through the dark, and an outstretched arm that seemed to point directly at the house, and the figure's brooding poise held something that plucked very faintly and lightly at memory. It was quite a distance from the house, almost at the very tip of the hill that seemed to be delicately taking flight into the shadowy sky. "Why, it's a snowman," Philip said. "Quite a good one, isn't it? Like a real man." "Of course it's a snowman. How odd I didn't know that at once. I wonder who made it. I thought you said we hadn't any neighbors." Nancy remained at the window, attempting to disentangle that elusive skein of remembrance. "No more we have, thank God. What's a honeymoon in the lap of neighbors? But I dare say some children walked a few miles for the excitement of trespassing." He looked at her closely. "Nancy, if you don't like it, I'll go out and kick it down." Nancy was startled again by his nearness to her. He had read her thoughts, known at once that there was something about the distant white figure which he found displeasing. "Oh, no," she said. "It's really quite a pretty thing. It is clever. I think I'll go out and have a look at it. Want to come?" "No, I believe I'll start dinner." Philip had wanted to bring a maid with them, but Nancy had preferred to have their perfect 2 weeks in his lodge alone. It would be soon enough that they would have to go back to New York and begin a household and responsibilities. She watched him when he was out of the house, taking the snowy hill in young, nimble strides, his overcoat flapping open from his limber body. Her heart seemed to follow him up the white path, part of Philip, and knowing that being married to him had rescued her life, her sanity, she saw him approach the snowman. He was slapping his gloved hands together as though it was cold, and the steam of his breathing wreathed his head. It was when she saw their meeting, the man of flesh and the man of snow, that she caught that half-vanished, slippery memory that had troubled her before. Now, as though full-bodied, it plunged violently into her hands. She sat down suddenly in the cretonne-covered easy-chair, because the hinges of her knees had loosened. How many times had she seen Spencer stand just as the snowman stood, his weight thrown to one foot, his arm pointing out something at a distance to her, his head pointing too, perhaps to a distant blue-white peak, or to a chalet perched like a bird's nest on a Swiss mountainside. But that had been his clumsy, curious way. Whoever had made the snowman had caught it exactly, by some unhappy mischance, as though he had worked from a blueprint. After a few minutes, she got up again and went downstairs, wanting the stability of familiar, simple tasks. She would be an absurd little fool to be troubled by a child's fumbled statue, just because it happened to resemble, in an accidental gesture, a dead man. Her thoughts worried and confused, she drew close the figured curtains in the living room and began to prepare their simple meal. Philip, when he came in, was rosy, breathing out cold, frozen air. "He's an elegant snowman," he said, "with bits of coal for chest buttons, and a charming pipe. I'm half inclined to take it out of his mouth and use it myself." "Oh, I wouldn't touch it," she said quickly. "After all, the children might come back and want it. You're cold, Philip." "Not now." He had taken her into his arms. The fire on the hearth hissed softly, sleepily. "Philip," she said, "you will always love me? Nothing will ever turn you from me?" "Does a man turn from himself?" he said, his eyes serious. "That is it now. You're part of me. Is something troubling you, Nancy? I think sometimes," his voice sharpened, "that I can never free you from what he did to you, like someone who had recovered from a wound but will never lose the scars." "Oh, foolish," she said, feeling the darkness and the cold retreating from about her. She was safe now. She must always remember that. "You've almost cured me, darling. Give me just a little longer to forget entirely." They climbed up the hard-frozen path together in the darkness, Philip's gloved hand snug about hers. Ahead of them, the solitary light they had left in the house beckoned warmly. They had been dining with friends of Philip's in New York, amusing, nice friends, but it seemed good to Nancy for them to be coming home together now. Philip's spotlight laid a neat round circle on the frost-touched ruts in the path. "Snow coming," he said quietly, his voice floating back to her. She thought that she too could smell in the air the smoky wet sweetness that meant snow. "How nice," she said, ending it in a soft yawn. That would mean tomorrow just she and Philip shut in together. No callers, only themselves, enough for a whole world. She fumbled in the depths of her bag for the key she could hear tinkling there as their feet rang upon the cold stones before the door. Philip was idly swishing the pale nub of light about on the hillside, picking forth tree and bush and snow-crusted rock that looked unfamiliar in the faint illumination. "Hello," he said suddenly. "The sculptors have been at work again. They've moved their snowman." Her glance followed the direction of his up the slope. "So they have," she cried, her voice odd. The snowman was fully 10 feet nearer the house, standing boldly on a small knoll, its frozen coat a-glitter from the dark. It seemed to Nancy, brought forward into prominence as it was, its skinny arm pointing straight at the house, to have achieved a curious air of menace, and she was again disturbed by its haunting resemblance. She turned quickly to Philip. "Why should they have moved it? It seems such a stupid thing to do. And why do they pick our backyard to play in when they have a whole world of snow?" She could feel Philip looking at her. "Curiosity, I suppose. If it bothers you, I'll watch tomorrow and chase them, little pests." "It doesn't bother me exactly, but it's queer. Let's see if it's moved in the morning. It's on that knoll now, right beside the pine." "It couldn't have moved in the morning," he said gently. "That's a little fanciful, Nancy, darling." His hand caught up hers, and they went into the house together. But the edge of its welcome had been taken off for her. Somewhere in her mind was a thought she did not care to recognize, that there was something very queer about the snowman, and whether it gave it undue importance or not, she resolved that she would have Philip kick the thing down tomorrow and rescue her from its unblinking, patient regard. In the night, Nancy awakened to hear snow hissing softly among the bare branches about the house and tapping on the window panes. It seemed to her drowsy and sleep-filled mind an intolerably lonely and desolate sound, and she huddled closer to Philip's warm, unconscious body, her eyes for a little while wide open and fixed upon the darkness of the cold room. When morning came, their bedroom bloomed with the pale light of the snow, a tumult of flakes riding the wind. When they kissed each other, the very taste of the snow in the air was soft on their lips. They dressed quickly and went to the windows together. "It will keep up all day," Philip said, his hands spread wide on the sill. "Lovely. No callers to congratulate the newlywed." Her eyes followed the dark outline of his face, that face which the first time she had seen it had seemed to call her clearly as though he had said her name. "Yes, darling," she said contentedly, and then looked out again at the near slate sky faintly visible above the falling flakes, and at the deep-piled white hillside. Suddenly, her fingers caught hold of his warm wrist. "There were... surely," she said, her tongue clumsy. "No children here last night between 2 o'clock and now." She left it there between them, unanswerable, for Philip to explain. "There are no footprints around it, Philip. Last night when we came in, it was on the knoll beside the pine. Oh, Philip." "Hush, darling," he said, his eyes searching the snowman. A puzzled frown hatched across his forehead. It was so close that she could see the bits of coal that made the buttons on its bulbous chest. Fully 20 feet above loomed the empty knoll where it had stood last night, the pine's snow-crested branches leaning heavily. The figure was freshly touched with snow. The pointing arm had thickened all along its length, and on the pipe clamped tight in the white mouth, a little disfiguring hat of snow had formed. "It's some mischief," Philip said quietly at last. "Somebody's idea of a good joke. What else could it be?" He looked at her, taking her shoulders between his hands. "Supernatural? You know, darling, that's utterly absurd." Even looking back into Philip's clean, sane eyes, her fears did not shrivel. They only hid behind her words. "Of course," she said weakly. "An isolated farming community like this must have its quota of half-wits. It's somebody's idea of fun." But she got no feeling of fun from the empty hillside dominated by the queer, misshapen figure. Only 30 feet or so from the house, it still maintained its intolerable resemblance. So many times had she seen Spencer stand in just that fashion, pipe pinched tight between his jaws, weight thrown to one side, head also to one side. "Philip," she said, looking away from the drifting snow, "will you go out and kick it down? I'm sick of it." Before she hardly phrased it to herself, it could come any closer. "I think that's really giving it too much importance," he said quietly. "But if you want, I do want." She wanted more than anything else to see an innocent hillside again. "Perhaps you had better take an axe. It's probably frozen quite hard." "All right, then," he said, with a sudden effort at lightness, as though he were worried about her and did not want to show it. "This will be a blow to our self-appointed humorist." She went downstairs with him and watched from the window as he climbed the hillside, his big shoulders already thickening with snow, the axe swinging lightly in his hand. The windy rattle of the casements was in her ears as she saw his figure appearing and disappearing in flooding veils of snow. Unaware of the gesture, Nancy put her hand up to her throat as he approached the figure. He stood opposite it a moment, examining it, hefting the axe. And then the axe swung heavily in his hands, cut off the snowman's head, sent it flying ponderously away. In a few minutes, there was nothing left but clumsy chunks of snow scattered here and there, each of which Philip followed up methodically and chopped and trampled into powder. Nancy, at the window, took a deep breath and went into the kitchen. It was gone. It would be hunched upon the hill no longer to startle her looking out. When Philip shucked his overcoat, he came into the kitchen where Nancy was measuring out coffee into the drip pot. The blue kettle already hissed upon the stove. "Our snowman is defunct," he said, rubbing his hands. "However, I saved his pipe. Obliged to. It's much too good to throw away." He took it from his pocket and turned it in his fingers admiringly, wiping it dry with a handkerchief. "Isn't that a honey?" He held it out to her. She said absently, carefully spooning eggs into a pot of boiling water, and then glanced at it to please him. It was rather a nice pipe, wasn't it? Far too good for a snowman's cold lips. Where had she seen one like it before? Puzzled, she took it from his hand. Suddenly, the kitchen began to spin about her in large black circles, roaring circles of darkness and sound. Philip caught her as she fell. When she opened her eyes, her face was wet. His sopping handkerchief was held to her forehead. "I'm all right," she said weakly. Philip's white, worried face hung above her. To her whirling brain it seemed as big as a moon. And then she felt his arm lifting her as he carried her inside to the couch in the living room and covered her with a woolen throw. "Better?" he said, sitting down beside her, massaging her cold hands in his warm fingers. "I'll have some hot coffee for you in a moment. What happened, Nancy?" For a moment, she could not remember. She could only remember her legs turning to straw under her, and her body going down into roaring waves. And then suddenly, as though something had touched her and said, "Think, Nancy," she remembered. Philip leaned down beside her. "There is nothing to be afraid of. What is it, darling? Tell me." The words came out in a prolonged, half-senseless flood from where they had been waiting, green-scummed, stagnant for a year. "That pipe, the Snowman's, that was Spencer's pipe. I've seen it 1,000,000 times, Philip. It has his initial on it, S.R., and there's a little crack." She paused. "I remember when it split and he had it mended. It's his, but it couldn't be, because it's down a crevasse in Switzerland with him. And the men told me nobody had ever gone to the bottom of that crevasse. Nobody could." She lay looking up into his dark, worried eyes. "It couldn't come up out of that crevasse. Philip, Spencer's death wasn't an accident." Philip's eyes changed suddenly, as though behind them a strange and disturbing thought had come. "What do you mean, Nancy?" he said sharply. "You're talking nonsense. You're ill. No, no. You promised me nothing would ever make any difference to your love." The scene she was about to tell gathered force, pictured itself for her as it had 1,000 times since it had happened, so that it was hardly any effort to put it into speech. That day it happened. That morning, I had asked him for a divorce. I told him I wanted to marry you. He refused. He made jokes. You never met him. You can't know how cruel and filthy he could be when he wanted to. He called me a... Nancy's head was aching, a deep, thundering throb in her skull. That morning, we went climbing, just the two of us. He liked it that way. We were both very good at it. And we were going up a bad place, roped together. And he said suddenly, I was ahead of him. This would be a nasty place for you to get careless. And I turned around, and he was looking up at me. His eyes seemed to get scared. If he hadn't been afraid, I wouldn't have thought of it. I was up there safe on the ledge, with the rope braced around a rock, and there he was, climbing at a very bad spot where he needed the help of the rope. The clean, biting air seemed to come back to her, apple green, cold, and that instant of blinding temptation. If I hadn't thought of what it would mean with him gone, and we free to marry, it still wouldn't have happened. But thinking of that seemed to break down my will, and I never looked at him again, but I took out my knife. She hadn't looked at him again, but she could remember it perfectly. Spencer clawing at the rock like a terrified spider, his whitening jaws clamped tight around the stem of his pipe, as he clawed there without a word, seeking frantically for a foothold. She went on, and I cut the rope with my knife, and he went down, like a bird that had been shot, turning over and over in the still air without a sound, the pipe still clamped tight in his mouth. The little Swiss papers had headlined it, Terrible Climbing Accident, and the men had assured her sorrowfully that she would never see her husband again. No one could ever plumb the depths of the black, gaping crack into which he had fallen. Spencer's pipe, she thought numbly, must be at the bottom of that crevasse, deep where no one could ever reach it, or Spencer. And yet a few moments ago she had held the pipe in her hand. She knew it had been there, the bowl in her palm, ice-cold and repellent. She closed her eyes, and then she felt Philip's fingers gentle on her face. "Poor Nancy," he said. That is a terrible thing to have carried alone for a year. She looked up at him. You must hate me, Philip. Hate her for having fouled their shining relationship. Hate you? How many times do you think I killed him in my heart? He took her hand in his. And was it murder? Was it a long-planned ugly thing? Didn't it happen in the flash of a moment, because he had pushed you over the brink of torture? He leaned down and kissed her. Nancy, don't worry any more. In a little while, they set about getting their breakfast. It was when they were carrying the coffee and fruit into the table that Nancy said suddenly, fright pinching cold about her heart again, But Philip, that pipe, where could it have come from? Whoever made the snowman, he said quietly, also happened to have a pipe that looked like Spencer's. S.R. could stand for anything under the sun, Nancy. Samuel Ridgely, Solomon Rivers, but not Spencer Rogers. Now, let's stop thinking and talking about a tiresome and unpleasant joke, and we'll never think again, Nancy, about what you told me just now. He picked up the pipe and tossed it into the fire. Never, she said. Of course Philip was right. A chance resemblance, that was all. S.R. could stand for almost anyone's name, and she need never think again of that icy, windswept Switzerland mountain. She had told it. It was confessed. The snowman was kicked down, and she had seen Philip throw his pipe into the fire. A deep feeling of relief in her heart, she looked out at the hillside, innocent and empty in the falling snow. There was nothing of the snowman left at all. The snow deepened and deepened through the day, heaping the house and the hillside in thickening white drifts. Nancy felt that it closed her into a happiness that she had never known. She had told the horror that had tormented her for a year like black wings hovering above her head. She felt clean-swept and free, and it had not torn Philip from her. It seemed as though it had tightened the bond between them, made it everlastingly secure. They had had dinner. Philip was yawning over a brief he worked on, now and then glancing up at her with his slow, warming smile. Nancy, looking at the dying fire, saw that it wanted mending. "We need more logs," she said. "No, don't get up, Phil. I'd like some fresh air." She put on a coat and went out. The wind had died, and the snow fell silently as feathers from the night. She picked up an armful of the small split logs and stood there, looking about, flakes lodging gently in her eyelashes. And then the logs tumbled from her arms into the deep snow with a smothered thunder. Gasping Philip's name, her hands groping frantically for the knob of the closed door, she got the door open somehow and locked and bolted it behind her. She faced the bright light of the living room, her mouth opening and closing without any words. Philip leaped from his chair. "Nancy, what is it? What's wrong?" He grasped her trembling hands and held them still. "Philip." She clutched at those warm, firm hands as though they were all that kept her from drowning in terror. "The snowman, out there on the path." So close to the house now that its ice-cold arm all but touched the windows. With a muttered curse, dragging her with him because she would not let go his hands, Philip ran to the window and thrust the curtain aside. The white stare of the snowman peered in at them. He swept the curtain shut again. His face was very pale, but his jaw jutted suddenly, angrily. "That settles it," he cried. "We go back to New York tonight." His eyes searched hers. "Don't be afraid. It can't harm you. It's only snow. It's—" He found no more words. She felt herself being pulled from the room. Her legs were like straws under her. She could not think or move of her own will. All that she knew was that now retribution was coming, and Philip could not stop it for her. "No use, Philip. No use," she repeated over and over. But she let him take her with him up the stairs, trembled beside him as he packed their bags hastily, leaving bureau drawers gaping, forgetting things, his look coming back to her constantly, stricken with anxiety for her. He took the bags in one hand and pushed the electric light switch. White, swaying snow shadows spilled into the room, soft upon the walls. Like little clocks, snow ticked against the windows. His other hand caught hers. "Nancy," he said imploringly. She stumbled after him out into the dim hall. She could not feel his fingers knotted about hers. A great hard cold seemed to be creeping upward toward her heart. They went down the dark stairs, the bags bumping clumsily against the wall, and then, upon the lower landing, they were stricken into stillness, motionless, dumb. Through the house it sounded hollowly, like a measured, angry drumbeat, a knocking on the panels of the front door. Like a terrified beast, she clung to Philip, her eyes growing wide, her mouth dry as ashes. The knocking came again, thunderous. The small house, deep in snow, shook with it. Hysteria spilled into her brain, welling like dark floodwaters. She sank from Philip's hand, slid into a corner of the wall. "Open the door!" she cried, covering her eyes, groveling against the wall. "Open the door! The snowman wants to come in!" Jerry Bundler by W. Jacobs. It wanted a few nights to Christmas, a festival for which the small market town of Torchester was making extensive preparations. The narrow streets, which had been thronged with people, were now almost deserted. The Cheap Jack from London, with the remnant of breath left him after his evening's exertions, was making feeble attempts to blow out his naphtha lamp, and the last shops open were rapidly closing for the night. In the comfortable coffee room of the old Boar's Head, half a dozen guests, principally commercial travellers, sat talking by the light of the fire. The talk had drifted from trade to politics, from politics to religion, and so, by easy stages, to the supernatural. 3 ghost stories, never known to fail before, had fallen flat. There was too much noise outside, too much light within. The 4th story was told by an old hand with more success. The streets were quiet, and he had turned the gas out. In the flickering light of the fire, as it shone on the glasses and danced with shadows on the walls, the story proved so enthralling that George, the waiter, whose presence had been forgotten, created a very disagreeable sensation by suddenly starting up from a dark corner and gliding silently from the room. "That's what I call a good story," said one of the men, sipping his hot whiskey. "Of course, it's an old idea that spirits like to get into the company of human beings. A man told me once that he travelled down the Great Western with a ghost, and hadn't the slightest suspicion of it until the inspector came for tickets. My friend said the way that ghost tried to keep up appearances by feeling for it in all its pockets and looking on the floor was quite touching. Ultimately, it gave it up and, with a faint groan, vanished through the ventilator." "That'll do, Hurst," said another man. "It's not a subject for jesting," said a little old gentleman who had been an attentive listener. "I've never seen an apparition myself, but I know people who have, and I consider that they form a very interesting link between us and the afterlife. There's a ghost story connected with this house, you know." "Never heard of it," said another speaker, "and I've been here some years now." "It dates back a long time now," said the old gentleman. "You've heard about Jerry Bundler, George?" "Well, I've just heard odds and ends, sir," said the old waiter, "but I never put much count to 'em. There was one chap here what said he saw it, and the governor sacked him prompt." "My father was a native of this town," said the old gentleman, "and knew the story well. He was a truthful man, and a steady churchgoer, but I've heard him declare that once in his life he saw the appearance of Jerry Bandler in this house." "And who was this Bandler?" inquired a voice. "A London thief, a pickpocket, a highwayman, anything he could turn his dishonest hand to," replied the old gentleman, "and he was run to earth in this house one Christmas week, some 80 years ago. He took his last supper in this very room, and after he had gone up to bed, a couple of Bow Street runners, who had followed him from London but lost the scent a bit, went upstairs with the landlord and tried the door. It was stout oak and fast, so one went into the yard, and by means of a short ladder got onto the window-sill, while the other stayed outside the door. Those below in the yard saw the man crouching on the sill, and then there was a sudden smash of glass, and with a cry he fell in a heap on the stones at their feet. Then, in the moonlight, they saw the white face of the pickpocket peeping over the sill, and while some stayed in the yard, others ran into the house and helped the other man to break the door in. It was difficult to obtain an entrance even then, for it was barred with heavy furniture, but they got in at last, and the first thing that met their eyes was the body of Jerry dangling from the top of the bed by his own handkerchief." "Which bedroom was it?" asked 2 or 3 voices together. The narrator shook his head. "That I can't tell you. But the story goes that Jerry still haunts this house, and my father used to declare positively that the last time he slept here, the ghost of Jerry Bandler lowered itself from the top of his bed and tried to strangle him." "That'll do," said an uneasy voice. "I wish you'd thought to ask your father which bedroom it was." "What for?" inquired the old gentleman. "Well, I should take care not to sleep in it, and that's all," said the voice shortly. "There's nothing to fear," said the other. "I don't believe for a moment that ghosts could really hurt one. In fact, my father used to confess that it was only the unpleasantness of the thing that upset him, and that for all practical purposes Jerry's fingers might have been made of cotton wool for all the harm they could do." "That's all very fine," said the last speaker again. "A ghost story is a ghost story, sir. But when a gentleman tells a tale of a ghost in the house in which one is going to sleep, I call it most ungentlemanly." "Pooh, nonsense," said the old gentleman, rising. "Ghosts can't hurt you. For my own part, I should rather like to see one. Good night, gentlemen." "Good night," said the others. "And I only hope Jerry'll pay you a visit," added the nervous man as the door closed. "Bring some more whiskey, George," said a stout commercial. "I want keeping up when the talk turns this way." "Shall I light the gas, Mr. Malcolm?" said George. "No, the fire's very comfortable," said the traveller. "Now, gentlemen, any of you know any more?" "I think we've had enough," said another man. "We shall be thinking we see spirits next, and we're not all like the old gentleman who's just gone." "Old humbug," said Hurst. "I should like to put him to the test. Suppose I dress up as Jerry Bandler and go and give him a chance of displaying his courage." "Bravo," said Malcolm huskily, drowning 1 or 2 faint no's. "Just for the joke, gentlemen." "No, no, drop it, Hurst," said another man. "Only for the joke," said Hurst, somewhat eagerly. "I've got some things upstairs in which I'm going to play in the rivals, knee-breeches, buckles, and all that sort of thing. It's a rare chance. If you'll wait a bit, I'll give you a full-dress rehearsal entitled Jerry Bandler, or the Nocturnal Strangler." "You won't frighten us," said the commercial with a husky laugh. "I don't know that," said Hurst sharply. "It's a question of acting, that's all. I'm pretty good, ain't I, Summers?" "Oh, you're all right for an amateur," said his friend with a laugh. "I'll bet you a level sov you don't frighten me," said the stout traveller. "Done," said Hurst. I'll take the bet to frighten you first, and the old gentleman afterwards. These gentlemen shall be the judges." "You won't frighten us, sir," said another man, "because we're prepared for you. But you'd better leave the old men alone. It's dangerous play." "Well, I'll try you first," said Hurst, springing up. "No gas, mind." He ran lightly upstairs to his room, leaving the others, most of whom had been drinking somewhat freely, to wrangle about his proceedings. It ended in two of them going to bed. "He's crazy on acting," said Summers, lighting his pipe. "Thinks he's the equal of anybody, almost. It doesn't matter with us, but I won't let him go to the old man. And he won't mind so long as he gets an opportunity of acting to us." "Well, I hope he'll hurry up," said Malcolm, yawning. "It's after 12 now." Nearly half an hour passed. Malcolm drew his watch from his pocket and was busy winding it when George, the waiter, who had been sent on an errand to the bar, burst suddenly into the room and rushed towards them. "He's coming, gentlemen," he said, breathlessly. "Why, you're frightened, George," said the stout commercial, with a chuckle. "It was the suddenness of it," said George, sheepishly. "And besides, I didn't look for seeing him in the bar. There's only a glimmer of light there, and he was sitting on the floor behind the bar. I nearly trod on him." "Oh, you'll never make a man, George," said Malcolm. "Well, it took me unawares," said the waiter. "Not that I'd have gone to the bar by myself if I'd known he was there. And I don't believe you would either, sir." "Nonsense," said Malcolm. "I'll go and fetch him in." "You don't know what it's like, sir," said George, catching him by the sleeve. "It ain't fit to look at by yourself, it ain't indeed. It's got the—" "What's that?" They all started at the sound of a smothered cry from the staircase, and the sound of somebody running hurriedly along the passage. Before anybody could speak, the door flew open, and a figure bursting into the room flung itself, gasping and shivering, upon them. "What is it? What's the matter?" demanded Malcolm. "Why, it's Mr. Hurst." He shook him roughly, and then held some spirit to his lips. Hurst drank it greedily, and with a sharp intake of his breath, gripped him by the arm. "Light the gas, George," said Malcolm. The waiter obeyed hastily. Hurst, a ludicrous but pitiable figure in knee-breeches and coat, a large wig all awry, and his face a mess of grease-paint, clung to him, trembling. "Now, what's the matter?" asked Malcolm. "I've seen it," said Hurst, with a hysterical sob. "Oh, Lord, I'll never play the fool again. Never." "Seen what?" said the others. "Him. It. The ghost. Anything," said Hurst, wildly. "Rot," said Malcolm, uneasily. "I was coming down the stairs," said Hurst, "just capering down, as I thought it ought to do. I felt a tap." He broke off suddenly and peered nervously through the open door into the passage. I thought I saw it again," he whispered. "Look, at the foot of the stairs. Can you see anything?" "No, there's nothing there," said Malcolm, whose own voice shook a little. "Go on. You felt a tap on your shoulder." "I turned round and saw it. A little wicked head and a white, dead face. Pah!" "That's what I saw in the bar," said George. "Horrid it was. Devilish." Hurst shuddered, and, still retaining his nervous grip of Malcolm's sleeve, dropped into a chair. "Well, it's a most unaccountable thing," said the dumbfounded Malcolm, turning round to the others. "It's the last time I come to this house." "I leave tomorrow," said George. "I wouldn't go down to that bar again by myself, no, not for £50. "It's talking about the thing that's caused it, I expect," said one of the men. "We've all been talking about this and having it in our minds. And practically we've been forming a spiritualistic circle without knowing it." "Hang the old gentleman," said Malcolm heartily. "Upon my soul, I'm half afraid to go to bed. It's odd they should both think they saw something. I saw it as plain as I see you, sir," said George solemnly. "Perhaps if you keep your eyes turned up the passage, you'll see it for yourself." They followed the direction of his finger, but saw nothing, although one of them fancied that a head peeped round the corner of the wall. "Who'll come down to the bar?" said Malcolm, looking round. "You can go if you like," said one of the others with a faint laugh. We'll wait here for you." The stout traveller walked towards the door and took a few steps up the passage. Then he stopped. All was quite silent, and he walked slowly to the end and looked down fearfully towards the glass partition which shut off the bar. 3 times he made as though to go to it. Then he turned back, and, glancing over his shoulder, came hurriedly back to the room. "Did you see it, sir?" whispered George. "Don't know," said Malcolm shortly. "I fancied I saw something, but it might have been fancy. I'm in the mood to see anything just now. How are you feeling now, sir?" "Oh, I feel a bit better now," said Hurst, somewhat brusquely, as all eyes were turned upon him. "I dare say you think I'm easily scared, but you didn't see it." "Not at all," said Malcolm, smiling faintly despite himself. "I'm going to bed," said Hurst, noticing the smile and resenting it. "Will you share my room with me, Summers?" "I will with pleasure," said his friend, "provided you don't mind sleeping with the gas on full all night." He rose from his seat, and bidding the company a friendly good night, left the room with his crestfallen friend. The others saw them to the foot of the stairs, and having heard their door close, returned to the coffee-room. "Well, I suppose the bet's off," said the stout commercial, poking the fire and then standing with his legs apart on the hearthrug. "Though, as far as I can see, I won it. I never saw a man so scared in all my life. Sort of poetic justice about it, isn't there?" "Never mind about poetry or justice," said one of his listeners. "Who's going to sleep with me?" "I will," said Malcolm affably. "And I suppose we share a room together, Mr. Leake?" said the third man, turning to the fourth. "No, thank you," said the other briskly. "I don't believe in ghosts. If anything comes into my room, I shall shoot it." "That won't hurt a spirit, Leake," said Malcolm decisively. "Well, the noise'll be like company to me," said Leake, "and it'll wake the house too. But if you're nervous, sir," he added with a grin to the man who had suggested sharing his room, "George'll be only too pleased to sleep on the doormat inside your room, I know." "That I will, sir," said George fervently. "And if you gentlemen would only come down with me to the bar to put the gas out, I could never be sufficiently grateful." They went out in a body, with the exception of Leake, peering carefully before them as they went. George turned the light out in the bar, and they returned unmolested to the coffee-room, and, avoiding the sardonic smile of Leake, prepared to separate for the night. "Give me the candle while you put the gas out, George," said the traveller. The waiter handed it to him, and extinguished the gas, and at the same moment all distinctly heard a step in the passage outside. It stopped at the door, and, as they watched with bated breath, the door creaked and slowly opened. Malcolm fell back, open-mouthed, as a white, leering face with sunken eyeballs and close-cropped bullet head appeared at the opening. For a few seconds, the creature stood regarding them, blinking in a strange fashion at the candle. Then, with a sidling movement, it came a little way into the room and stood there as if bewildered. Not a man spoke or moved, but all watched with a horrible fascination as the creature removed its dirty neckcloth and its head rolled on its shoulder. For a minute it paused, and then, holding the rag before it, moved towards Malcolm. The candle went out suddenly, with a flash and a bang. There was a smell of powder, and something writhing in the darkness on the floor. A faint, choking cough, and then silence. Malcolm was the first to speak. "Matches," he said, in a strange voice. George struck one. Then he leapt at the gas, and a burner flamed from the match. Malcolm touched the thing on the floor with his foot and found it soft. He looked at his companions. They mouthed inquiries at him, but he shook his head. He lit the candle and, kneeling down, examined the silent thing on the floor. Then he rose swiftly, and dipping his handkerchief in the water jug, bent down again and grimly wiped the white face. Then he sprang back with a cry of incredulous horror, pointing at it. Leek's pistol fell to the floor, and he shut out the sight with his hands, but the others, crowding forward, gazed spellbound at the dead face of Hurst. Before a word was spoken, the door opened and Summers hastily entered the room. His eyes fell on the floor. "Good God!" he cried. "You didn't!" Nobody spoke. "I told him not to," he said in a suffocating voice. "I told him not to. I told him—" He leaned against the wall, deathly sick, put his arms out feebly, and fell fainting into the traveller's arms. One Christmas Eve by Elliott O'Donnell. 1. "Poor Auntie May, I do feel sorry for her," said the little boy with the solemn eyes. His sister nodded her head dismally. "So do I, Charlie, and I feel sorry for myself. Granny's temper is awful." There was a long pause after this, and both children gazed thoughtfully into the fire. "I would rather have stayed at school for Christmas," the boy murmured, kicking the heel of his left foot. "But for Auntie and you, I detest Granny. She is always scolding someone." "If I were Auntie, I would elope," the girl said. "I am sure Mr. Carson would do it." The sound of footsteps echoed along the passage, and a sharp, high-pitched voice called out, "May, May, wherever are you? It's too bad of you to be idling away the morning doing nothing. Come and read The Guardian to your father, or alter this blouse for me. You know the dressmakers can never fit me." "Oh, dear," sighed the little girl. "Poor Auntie May. It's Granny. I really can't stand her temper today of all days. She is sure to scold me for something." So saying, the little girl gently stole to the door, placed her brown head against it for a moment, smiled assuringly in the direction of Charlie, and stole out. The fire was warm, the weather intensely cold, and Charlie felt too comfortable to move far. So he simply crawled on all fours to the big screen near the fender and curled himself up behind it. By and by, he fell asleep. He hadn't been dozing very long before voices awoke him. At first, in his dreamy state, he couldn't imagine who they were, but he soon recognized them as those of his Auntie May and her fiancé. There was nothing Charlie hated so much as eavesdropping, and he would have been the first to denounce anyone else. Yet he didn't like to call out, for fear they should think he had been listening, and he didn't know how long they had been talking. He tried to think of something else. He stopped his ears, but he couldn't help hearing some of their remarks. "She really is beyond endurance," the young man was saying. "I never met a woman with such a temper." Auntie May sighed. "I can't help it," she replied. "I know she is very trying. I have often thought I would leave home and earn my living." The young man laughed ironically. "Earn your living," he said. "Good heaven! No other girl in England would do what you do for the paltry allowance you get, and with such an irritable stepmother to bully and hamper you every minute of the day, I feel as if—" Here he kicked the hearthrug fiercely. "As if I would like to—" "Hush," Auntie May whispered, placing her little hand over his mouth. "Remember, after all, she's a sort of mother, and I think at the bottom she means well. I wish we had enough money to marry at once. Don't you, darling?" Auntie May's eyes beamed. "I do indeed. Oh, wouldn't it be delightful, Hugh?" Just then, a big flame illuminated the wall by their side, and made them both look. "Isn't she some ancestor of yours, darling?" the young man asked, gazing at the portrait of a lady with curly hair and grey-blue eyes. It was a very pretty face. May nodded. "My great-aunt," she replied. "Poor thing, she had a sad history." "What happened to her?" "She interests me because she is very like you, only not so pretty." May smiled a little sadly. "You only say that to please me," she said. "I'm not pretty now. I'm too old." "Well, my great-aunt was engaged to be married to a poor man. Her parents were very rich, and they disapproved of the match. I imagine her mother's temper must have been a bit like my stepmother's, perhaps worse." Here Hugh grunted. "Anyhow, she was sorely tired, and in the end eloped one Christmas Eve. At least so it was generally supposed, as she vanished, taking with her a diamond necklace of immense value. If we only had the money it is said to have cost, we could marry. The funny part is that her young man was seen in the village afterward, and was alleged to have made inquiries about her. What became of them both no one ever knew, and the parents would never allow her name to be mentioned." "Rather strange about the young man," Hugh said, stirring the fire thoughtfully with a poker. "Do you think she really did elope?" May shook her head. "I can't say," she replied. "Her parents declared that the young man was a bad lot and wouldn't have him near the house. It was snowing when she was supposed to have left home, and no footmarks or any other traces of her were to be found. If she didn't join the young man, where could she have gone? Perhaps she committed suicide. She was very unhappy, wasn't she?" May shuddered. "How horrible," she murmured. "And do you know, she is said to haunt the house on Christmas Eve, though I can't say I have ever met anyone who has seen her." Hugh caught hold of the little hand nearest to him and kissed it tenderly. "Well, I wish I could see her, darling," he said, laughing. "Perhaps she might tell us a way out of our difficulty." Just then a well-known voice was heard from the dining room. "Now then, May, come, your father wants you to make his tea. I suppose you're only canoodling as usual. Do you hear me? Oh, what a thing it is to be old." "Oh, dear," sighed May, as she tore herself away from the strong pair of arms holding her down. "There is no peace for the weary." Hugh gazed longingly after her. "There goes an angel of a girl," he said aloud, "with a most unpleasant stepmother." And a subdued murmur from behind the screen re-echoed those sentiments. 2. After they had gone, Charlie came out of his hiding place. The room was delightfully cozy, with its fire no longer throwing out yellow flames, but rich with crimson embers. Outside were knots of elms and oaks, erect and silent, with their branches covered with snow, and the moon peeked between them as much as to say, "You shan't shut me out. I am determined to see what Santa Claus is doing this Christmas." Charlie loved the snow. He thought Churchdale was at its very best when the leaves and meadows glittered with their mantle of white. But his heart was bitter within him, as he thought of his grandmother's treatment of Auntie May, whom he loved passionately. He sat and gazed at the picture of her ancestress, and the longer he looked, the more his imagination led him to believe the beautiful eyes smiled into his. He heard a door open, and a shrill voice cry out, "Charlie, come down to tea at once. We can't keep the things on the table forever." Then Auntie May as usual caught it, and his grandfather's voice joined in with quotations from The Guardian, to which they all had to listen, although it bored them very much. Then his granny came out and stood at the foot of the stairs, and called louder than before. But Charlie felt very rebellious, and he did not go. He wanted to annoy her as a punishment for her behavior to Auntie May, and he also couldn't remove his eyes from the picture. Then he heard Mr. Carson suggest in a mild voice that Charlie must have gone out to tea at the vicarage. After that, there was a lull in the angry storm, and the old people's voices subsided into calmer and more rational tones. The room grew darker, for Charlie didn't put any more coal on the fire, and the shadows from without filed in through the bay windows in rapid succession. "You are pretty," Charlie sighed as he looked at the clear eyes. "I am sorry for you if you had a mother with such a temper as Granny. She is enough to make me almost hate her. She is such a beast to Auntie May, always scolding. Yes, Picture, I am awfully sorry for you. I heard this afternoon, what a rough time you had. You have lovely eyes, just my favorite color. How I should get ragged if the boys at school heard me talk like this. They don't care for reading, as I do. I think most of them will be doctors or lawyers or some such things, but I couldn't stand anything like that. I shall be a poet or an author, and make a name that will go down to— I don't know what people call it, but I shall be in the papers and Idler and tip-top magazines like that. But I won't love anyone as I do you. Do you hear me, Picture? You are my first love. Granny says love at first sight is all rubbish. She told Auntie so, but she doesn't know everything, although she thinks she does. Oh, I wish you would help Auntie May. It is Christmas Eve, and they say you haunt the place tonight. I shouldn't be afraid if I saw you. Won't you come and talk to me? I would like to ask you to kiss me. You have such pretty lips, and it sounds a bit soft. And then a ghost couldn't touch one. At least one can't touch a ghost. It grew darker and darker, and the fire flickered out its farewell in a tiny yellow flame that shot up its fork-like head and licked the face on the wall. Charlie gave a little jump. The eyes were most certainly smiling at him now, and, why, good heavens, the hand moved. He bounded to his feet. The picture was holding out its hands to him to help it down. He didn't feel the least bit afraid, but took the outstretched hands in his own. They were so cold that they sent a chill right through him. The lady shook her curls from her forehead and leaped lightly to the ground. She didn't speak, so Charlie held his tongue. He felt horribly shy, too, for the lady looked lovely. He was struck with admiration for the empire gown she was wearing. Putting one finger on her lips to enjoin silence, she glided to the conservatory door, and Charlie, who remembered the duties of a gentleman, hurried to open it for her. To his surprise, she passed right through it, and was waiting for him on the other side. She smiled assuringly at him, and his momentary fear departed. He followed gladly after her, and though he had neither overcoat, hat, nor boots, he was unconscious of the cold. She passed through the conservatory as if she was familiar with every inch of it, and then out onto the lawn, where the snow lay thick. He kept close to her heels, and she led him down the avenue, dark, save for the few patches of light made by the moon. Finally, she struck off to the right, down a path he seldom visited, and came to a halt in a tiny siding. Before her lay a dark hole overgrown with bushes and brambles. She pointed to it, and Charlie saw great tears in her eyes, while her lips moved as if she was talking to him. He knew she was in trouble, and a wave of love and pity swept through him. He sprang forward, forgetting the death trap before him. But she anticipated his movement, and he felt, for the second time, cold hands stretched out to save him. "Oh, kiss me," he whispered. "Just one, for you are too lovely for anything." It seemed to him then that something icy cold fell on his cheeks, just like the salt spray of the sea, and the next moment he was in her arms. A wild paroxysm of happiness surged through him, a joy so intense and restful that the feeling of it came back to him again and again in the grey days of his manhood. A drowsiness crept over him, and though he struggled hard to keep awake to see her face, it was without avail. He sank swiftly to sleep. When he awoke, someone was bending over him. It was Auntie May, and he was lying on the hearthrug beneath the picture. 3. I wonder if there is anything in it, Auntie May asked herself as Charlie finished his tale. I'm afraid it was only a very pretty dream, dear, she added aloud. See, there is the picture in its old place. Charlie raised his eyes. Yes, what Auntie said was true. There it was, and he saw with a pang that the eyes did not recognize him. He felt his shoes. They are wet, Auntie, he cried. Yes, they are, indeed. And so they were. In the morning, Charlie took May and Hugh down the avenue. He was wild with excitement, and even Hugh was obliged to own that it looked promising. At last they came to the path, then to the siding, and then, with a shout of triumph, to the dark hole. By Jove! Hugh exclaimed. The kid is right. I don't believe it was a dream, but the ghost after all. I will get down here. Auntie May begged him to be careful, but Hugh was a Celt and very superstitious. So a rope was fetched, without the granny's leave, and Hugh was lowered into the well. It seemed an eternity to all before he reappeared, but when he did so, they were rewarded for their patience. At the bottom of the well, which was dry, lay a skeleton, still clutching in its hand a jewel case. The latter contained a diamond necklace. That is it, Charlie cried the moment he saw it. That is the one the picture was wearing. And what little doubt they had on the point was set at rest when the medical authority pronounced it to be the skeleton of a woman. So they found a clue at last to that mystery of the Christmas Eve of long ago. The poor lady had missed her way in the snowstorm and had fallen down the well. She was laid to rest in the churchyard, and her spirit has never been seen again, though Charlie had implored it to come just for 1 minute. Even the cross grandmother became in a better humour when she saw the jewels, and yielded, with a good grace, to the unanimous desire that it should be given to Auntie May. It was, and with the money it fetched, a substantial wedding dower was provided for the young bride. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,